War came roaring back to Europe in the 1990s, and Europe had no idea what to do. This wasn't a distant crisis. It was in Sarajevo, just a 2-hour flight from Paris, and Europe stood frozen, unable to act. The Cold War had just ended, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was gone, and for a brief moment, Europe believed it had entered a post-war age, a time of peace, democracy, and prosperity. Then Yugoslavia fell apart. What followed was one of the most brutal conflicts in late 20th century Europe. A series of wars, ethnic cleansings and sieges that would leave over 130,000 dead and millions displaced. And this wasn't happening on the periphery. This was in the heart of Europe, a 2-hour flight from Paris. Sarajevo was closer to Vienna than Rome is to London. But Europe was caught completely off guard. Politically, militarily, even psychologically, it was unprepared for the return of war. The institutions built for peacekeeping and integration, the EU, the OSCE, the Western European Union, all proved toothless in the face of actual violence. In 1991, as Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, fighting broke out. The initial European response was confused and contradictory. Germany quickly recognised Croatian independence, while France and the UK hesitated. There was no unified strategy. Just a scramble of diplomatic statements and hastily arranged peace conferences. The European Community, the predecessor to the EU, declared that the hour of Europe has dawned. It was supposed to be the continent's coming-of-age moment, a test of its ability to manage its own backyard. But that moment quickly turned into a humiliation, as Bosnia descended into chaos, with atrocities piling up, concentration camps, mass executions, the shelling of civilians. Europe responded with hand-wringing and half measures. The EU sent observers, the UN sent peacekeepers, with no mandate to actually intervene. Britain and France contributed troops to the UN mission, but under rules of engagement so restrictive, they were often forced to stand by as civilians were massacred. Airstrikes were debated, then delayed. Arms embargoes were applied indiscriminately, hurting the outgunned victims more than the aggressors. And still, the killing went on. It wasn't until the Americans stepped in that the situation began to shift. By 1995, after the horrors of Srebrenica, where over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were executed under the watch of Dutch UN peacekeepers, Washington lost patience. The US led a NATO bombing campaign against Bosnian Serb forces and pushed the warring sides into negotiations. The result was the Dayton Accords, brokered not in Brussels or Paris or Berlin, but in Ohio. Let that sink in for a moment. A war on European soil, involving only European actors, was ultimately ended by American leadership on American territory. Europe watched from the sidelines. The Yugoslav Wars laid bare the gap between European aspirations and European capabilities. This wasn't some faraway crisis. This was a test of whether post-Cold War Europe could act as a geopolitical force. And the answer was, not yet. The policy failures weren't just moral, they were structural. Europe lacked not only a common foreign policy, but the means to project force. NATO existed, but it was American-led. The EU had no rapid reaction force. The Western European Union, a supposed defence arm, was impotent. National militaries were fragmented, uncoordinated, and constrained by domestic politics. Even countries with significant military capacity, like France and the UK, struggled to act decisively. And smaller EU states were either unwilling or unable to contribute meaningfully. When push came to shove, there was no European army. There wasn't even a shared chain of command. And it wasn't just about hardware, it was about mindset. After decades of peace, European leaders had internalized the idea that diplomacy and economic incentives were enough to manage conflict. War was seen as something outdated, irrational, preventable through dialogue. The idea that brute force might be necessary, that tanks and fighter jets still had a role, was deeply uncomfortable. The Yugoslav conflict shattered that illusion. It showed that war had not been banished from Europe. It had merely been dormant. And when it returned, Europe was caught sleepwalking. Even after the Dayton Accords, it was NATO, under US command, that maintained peace through troops on the ground in Bosnia. The EU would later take over some of these missions, but only once the hard part was over. And even then, many of its operations were logistical or symbolic. The heavy lifting had already been done by the Americans. What the Yugoslav Wars exposed was a continent that had grown used to peace and forgotten how to deal with its opposite. It had relied on institutions, treaties, and assumptions, but not on force. And when it needed force, it had none of its own to offer. This was Europe's first real military test after the Cold War, and it failed, not catastrophically, but decisively. It was the moment when the dream of a strategically autonomous Europe was put on pause, quietly shelved in favour of continued reliance on the US. Europe has long believed in negotiation as the path to peace. It's one of the EU's foundational values. The idea that dialogue, compromise, and consensus can resolve even the most intractable conflicts. And often that's true. But negotiation without leverage isn't diplomacy. It's pleading. Without hard power to back it up, Europe's efforts in the Balkans were little more than well-meaning conferences and unenforceable agreements. The tragedy of the Yugoslav Wars wasn't just the violence, it was the realization that Europe's preferred toolkit had no weight behind it. Influence, it turned out, still required force. And the lesson stuck. For years afterward, European foreign and defence policy remained timid, fragmented, reactive. There were small steps. Peacekeeping in the Balkans, a few interventions in Africa, talk of a common security policy. But the muscle wasn't rebuilt, the political will wasn't there. It would take another threat, bigger, louder, and much more dangerous, to force Europe to start taking military power seriously again. And that threat was Russia,